6. Space Mountain. If they want O, they coming to get O. Omari O-Dog McCree. On the evening of October 22nd, 2004, BMF's lieutenants were scrambling. Regardless of whether they were disturbed by or even clued into what had gone down a few weeks earlier at the townhouse off Highland Avenue, they were faced at the moment with a more pressing matter. Meech needed a ride. The problem was he needed a ride from the DeKalb County Jail. No one wanted to show up at the lockdown in a sparkling new Porsche or late model Benz. That would send the wrong message. But one of them needed to go get the boss out fast, and they definitely needed to figure out what had landed him there in the first place. Meech's go-to girl, Yogi, the woman through whom most of his administrative orders passed, was hoping to take control of the situation. "I need a low-ass key car," Yogi mused, her husky voice taking on a softer tone, like a Honda. Omari O-Dog McCree, clearly one of Meech's favorite soldiers, was quick to offer his services to Yogi. "What time you have to pick him up? 'Cause I might could, get a..." She didn't let him finish. "See, I just talked to the court officer, so the paperwork is going in as we speak." Yogi was always bailing people out, taking care of business, looking out for the family. That was her job. In fact, she'd warned Omari earlier that day that he needed to take his new car home and park it. He couldn't be doing any extra driving, not in a $100,000 Porsche. According to Yogi, Vince DeMock, an attorney working several of the family's cases, advised that all those new cars doubled as big, fat targets on wheels. Vince said anything we're driving without a license tag on it, they're pulling it. She told Omari earlier that day. Then Yogi personalized it in a way that must have made Omari cringe. "They know who you are," she told him. "You got pending shit. You know, it ain't even worth it, riding around or whatever. "All right," Omari had conceded. "So take it in, sit it down." "All right." Now, however, several hours later, it was Yogi who was at a loss for a vehicle. She couldn't drive her new Benz to the jail to get Meech, but what else could she do? Nobody seemed to have a modest ride these days. "What I need is a fucking rental," she told Omari. But compared with everything else going on, her car frustrations were a minor inconvenience. More disturbing was the fact that someone seemed to be keeping too close an eye on the family. The rumor was that Omari was to blame, he and his friend Jeffrey Lear. The two were so close, most people thought they were brothers, were the prime suspects in a quadruple shooting at a nightclub the week before. Nobody had been killed, and the incident quickly blew over in the local press. But the gun battle at the Atrium, one of the city's veteran hip-hop clubs, was arousing suspicion in BMS circles. Were the cops tailing Omari and Jeffrey with the hope of charging them with the shootings? Or were they biding their time in an attempt to gain wider insight into the organization? Was the Atrium incident somehow responsible for Meech getting nabbed on bunk charges? Or was that just a fluke? Never mind that Meech seemed to have a soft spot for O-Dog, perhaps seeing something of himself in the rebellious young tough who rose up from the corners of Boulevard to bona fide baller status. Getting your boss, even a sympathetic one, in trouble because of your own heat? Not good. The barrage of phone calls Omari was fielding wasn't exactly encouraging either. The streets were talking, and the talk was not casting him in a positive light. About an hour after Omari hung up with Yogi, his phone rang again. "Oh, I was just calling to check on you, make sure you was all right," a sweet-voiced girl gushed. "I had heard some stuff. I said, let me call him." "Yeah, I've been hearing shit too. What you heard?" "Huh? Something about some shooting shit at Atrium, and I guess it's like they got him at the club or something." "They what?" "They were saying they had got Meech at the club," the girl said. 2 days earlier, in the pre-dawn hours of October 20th, 2004, DeKalb County Police had set up a roadblock outside a strip club called Pinups on Ponce de Leon Avenue, a few miles east of Atlanta city limits. The department claimed that the incident at the Atrium, as well as another recent shootout at a strip club called Jazzy T's, warranted a safety checkpoint at the Pinups intersection, though it wasn't particularly close to the site of either shooting. Shortly before 5 a.m., the roadblock snared a Dodge Magnum that was leaving the club. Officers claimed the car smelled suspiciously of weed. They arrested the driver, Hamza Hewitt, who was one of Jay-Z's bodyguards and was now believed to be Meech's and both passengers. Charges against Hewitt were later dismissed. One of the passengers gave the name Ricardo Santos. At the station, Santos was placed in an empty interview room. Shortly after 9 a.m., a detective passed by, glanced through a small observation window embedded in the door, and caught sight of something that stopped him in his tracks. The man, who'd been strolling back and forth across the interrogation room's floor, suddenly paused, and with an air of nonchalance hanging over him, he pissed on the wall. After a while, the man finally agreed to speak to investigators. Almost immediately, he let slip his real name. An officer asked if his last name might be Flannery, and he corrected the pronunciation. Regardless, one of the cops already had recognized him as Big Meech. After all, his pictures had been all over the papers the year before, when he'd been arrested for the Buckhead double homicide. By the time of the Pinups roadblock, the Buckhead case had gone stale, and most of the conditions of Meech's bond had been lifted, and so DeKalb County didn't have much to pin on Meech following his arrest. They couldn't get him for bond violation because there was nothing left to violate. After charging him with carrying false identification and interference with government property, interfering with the wall of the interrogation room, the county granted him a $30,000 bond. 2 days later, the family was readying to spring him and to get to the bottom of what was going on. Meech had been locked up for nearly 3 days when, shortly after midnight, on October 23, 2004, Yogi called Amari with marching orders. "Your boss said, have your ass at the elevator." "He act like I did something wrong," Amari laughed, a trace of uneasiness in his voice. "But all right." Amari had reason to be nervous about the meeting. As the girl on the phone suggested, there appeared to be some sort of connection between Meech's arrest and the Atrium incident. Had he known the real reason why trouble seemed to be following him, however, he'd have been infinitely more stressed. That's because by the time those 4 people were shot at the Atrium, investigators were well on their way to cornering Amari O-Dog McCree, and they were inching ever closer to their ultimate prize, Amari's boss. For months, a special drug task force had been climbing the food chain of local drug dealers, using confidential informants and undercover cocaine purchases as points of entry, and eventually graduating to a hard-earned wiretap investigation. It wasn't the Atrium shootings that had piqued the investigators' interest in Amari McCree and the crew to which he had belonged, though for the purposes of the investigation, the shootings couldn't have happened at a more opportune time. Rather, it was a seemingly unrelated drug deal in a down-and-out Atlanta neighborhood that eventually would lead a team of undercover agents to the curb outside Amari's swanky Buckhead townhouse. Across the country, local cops and federal agents have been teaming up for what were called High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, or HITTA task forces. HITTA was the brainchild of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, an effort to stymie the flow of cocaine, crack, and heroin into the country's most blighted urban neighborhoods. The Atlanta HITTA office comprised 2 units, manned by the best and brightest of the DEA, Atlanta Police Department, and Georgia Bureau of Investigation, including the APD's Detective Bryant Burns, who was working with the DEA's Jack Harvey and Fulton prosecutor Rand Shea to break the Black Mafia family's code of silence. HITTA's responsibility was to dismantle drug trafficking organizations, the kind that, due to a lack of resources, typically evade most big city police departments and cut short the reign of violent career criminals. To that end, task force agents were given luxuries that cash-strapped police departments coveted: high-tech wiretapping equipment, fleets of undercover vehicles, and most important, unimpeded time. Agents had the benefit of months or even years to develop confidential sources, track the finances of kingpins, and sit, wait, and watch as the tide of drugs ebbed and flowed into such downtrodden Atlanta neighborhoods as Boulevard, The Bluff, and Bankhead. The idea was to track the large shipments by starting with the smaller sales that trickled down to the street, working backwards from the corner dealers who delivered the product to the consumer, and blazing a trail toward the 3-car garages of upper-level suppliers who had direct connections to the overseas sources. As with most cities, Atlanta in the early 2000s was serviced by a handful of major drug distributors, from whom all the city's cocaine, bound over from Colombia or more likely Mexico, originated. And in Atlanta, all those distributors got their coke from BMF. And so while HITTA's work could be tedious, The reward in Atlanta was clear. Follow any street-level drug purchase back to its source, and you're bound to find yourself at Meech and Terry's doorstep. Of course, it wasn't so easy as strolling up to the door of the White House with an arrest warrant. For years, cops and prosecutors had fielded countless tips and rumors implicating BMF in the drug trade, but hard and fast evidence was more elusive. The dealers, even though several steps removed from BMF, usually suspected that they were being watched, and so they spoke in code, relied on near untraceable prepaid cell phones or phones in friends' names, and made a habit of ditching numbers they thought were hot. Once word spread that a dealer had been nabbed with dope, he was immediately excommunicated, and so the dealer often was useless, even if in the off chance he agreed to cooperate with the authorities. Getting to those upper-level guys at the heart of BMF was like running up and down an escalator. Falter even for a moment, and you're right back at the bottom. Raphael Smurf Allison wasn't exactly at the bottom of the rung, but he wasn't high up either. He was a modest crack cocaine trafficker, a big fish in a small pond known as Pittsburgh. The Atlanta neighborhood just across I-75 from Turner Field was less congested than Boulevard or the Bluffs, but street-level drug deals there were just as rampant. 22 years old and dealing in multiple ounces at a time, Smurf took in between $1,000 and $3,000 per deal, and he sometimes did several deals a day. He'd been a hit to target for 3 years, since 2001, and he was considered by agents to be sloppy enough to possibly serve as a line to a bigger catch. In July 2004, hit-to agents had been lucky enough to secure a confidential informant who had ingratiated himself to Smurf and was able to buy multiple ounces of crack from him 3 times in a month. Smurf even gave the informant his cell phone number so that the informant could buy dope anytime. The agents also had an idea of who Smurf's supplier might be. One day, a surveillance team followed Smurf to a suspected re-up, a replenishment of one drug supply. At a BP gas station on the corner of Ponce de Leon and Monroe Drive, it appeared that a man sitting in a brown Pontiac Grand Prix stepped out of the car to hand a package to Smurf. The Grand Prix, the surveillance agents learned, was titled to a woman named Sharmella Hoskins. Armed with proof of the drug deals with Smurf's digits, Fulton County prosecutor Rand Shea put together a 30-page application seeking a wiretap on Smurf's phone. Shea had been collaborating with the task force agents for months, ostensibly to advise on legal matters such as those pertaining to Smurf's wiretap, and perhaps more to the point because he felt a certain kinship with the cops who went after major drug dealers. Shea felt at home with the task force. Through it, he was connected to Harvey at the DEA, whom he admired, and the APD's Bryant, who was his best friend. It took an excruciating month and a half for the wiretap application to pass District Attorney Paul Howard's muster, but finally, in early September 2004, the wiretap was approved, and the agents, holed up in a series of cubbyholes flanking a long hallway at HITA's headquarters, began to pore over Smurf's calls. Working the wire was difficult at times. The voyeuristic novelty wore off fast. In the meantime, the higher-ups wanted results, and so the agents listening to the calls had to try to deliver that which only fate could provide. Unlike some of the other task force agents with whom they worked in tandem, the guys assigned to the wire didn't get to experience the rush of surveillance or the satisfaction of laying their eyes on their target. They would pore over the line sheets, the call-by-call synopsis of what came over the wire and try to find a pattern. And it was through their work that the case finally started coming together. The idea was to get the informant to make another crack purchase from Smurf. Then listen in as Smurf rang his supplier to replenish his cachet, thereby nailing down the supplier's number. Sure enough, when the informant met with Smurf on September 3, 2004, asking if he could pick up 4 ounces, Smurf promptly dialed up the food chain. He asked for a 400 tray. The supplier let Smurf know he only had a deuce hard and a deuce soft, 2 ounces each of crack and powder. The task force now had Smurf's supplier's number. What's more, the phone was listed under the name Sharmella Hoskins, the same name that appeared on the title of the Grand Prix that the agents had eyeballed in the BP parking lot. But to succeed with another wiretap application for the supplier's phone, the agents would need more than the name Sharmella Hoskins. Over the next 2 weeks, the wiretap agents kept a close listen on Smurf's calls, hoping he would carry them closer to the supplier, whose voice materialized on the other end of the line. One day in mid-September, the wiretap team listened as Smurf told his supplier he was on his way to meet him. One of the agents contacted the surveillance team that was camped outside Smurf's house and told them to follow the target. Keeping a safe distance, the surveillance agents split up into several cars and followed Smurf to a posh apartment complex on the city's industrial west side. Now they had a suspected address for Smurf's supplier. 2 days later, the county judge authorized a wiretap on the supplier, whom investigators later identified as DeCarlo Hoskins, Sharmella's husband. Right away, as soon as the wiretap was up, DeCarlo called his supplier. Agents perked up at the all-too-obvious drug talk. DeCarlo had a complaint about a recent delivery. It sounded as if his supplier had floated him some bad dope. "I had like one more that was fucked up real bad, homie," DeCarlo said. "There wasn't anything wrong with that, Lo," the voice replied. "I ain't doing nothing out of it," DeCarlo practically spat. "But you could tell it was real fucked up. It got a logo on it, but the whole shit just like brown, you know what I mean? You sure? If you seen it, you know it wasn't right." 2 days later, investigators caught another break. DeCarlo was plotting what sounded like a major drug sale to 3 men from out of town. DeCarlo told the potential buyers to meet him at his spot. Hit agents took that to mean his West Side apartment. They positioned themselves at the complex, one car in the lot and another in the parking deck, and they waited. Based on what was discussed during the call, the investigators were expecting a gray Nissan Altima to pull into the apartment complex between noon and 1 p.m. After picking up the drugs, DeCarlo's 3 customers were supposed to head down Northside Drive to the Georgia Dome to watch the Falcons game. Sure enough, agents watched as a gray Altima pulled into one of the visitor spaces at around 12:30 p.m. 2 minutes later, a black Infiniti, which agents believed was driven by DeCarlo, pulled into the space in front of it. One of the guys in the Altima hopped into the Infiniti, and it took off across the parking lot to a place the surveillance team couldn't quite see. A few minutes later, the Infiniti returned, and the man climbed back into the Altima. Both cars bolted. The Altima headed south on Howell Mill Road, past the neighborhood's loft buildings and warehouses, with the surveillance agents in slow pursuit. Merging into Northside Drive, maneuvering through the game day traffic that snaked toward the dome, a HITSA agent radioed Atlanta police. It was time to request a traffic stop. As soon as the patrol car flashed its lights, the guy in the Altima's passenger seat called DeCarlo. He said they were about to be pulled over, and he said that if the police asked him to get out of the car, they'd gun it instead. "Keep it in drive," DeCarlo warned. An Atlanta police officer approached the Altima and asked the driver for his license. A moment later, one of the HITSA agents approached the car on the other side. He told the passenger to quit talking on his cell phone and step out of the vehicle. That's when the agent saw a Smith & Wesson .357 on the Altima's floorboard. The men didn't act on their promise to DeCarlo. They didn't hit the gas. They didn't put up a fight either. And in the trunk of the car, agents found a Louis Vuitton tote bag packed with 7 individually wrapped kilos of coke, and another shopping bag stuffed with 2 more. The coke was wrapped tightly and professionally, as if it had been cut only once or twice since landing in the States. To Shade, that was a good sign. That meant they were closer to the Black Mafia family than he first imagined. Down at HITSA headquarters on Juniper Street, the men refused to talk, but the agents didn't need them to. Investigators now had enough evidence to take down DeCarlo, the suspected source of the dope, and hopefully by extension, DeCarlo's supplier. Yet finding DeCarlo proved trickier than expected. He was cautious. After his 3 customers were busted on the way to the Falcons game, he decided to ditch his phone. It would have been a smart move had he not used his old phone to call and establish a new account. The wiretap agents were listening as DeCarlo's cell phone provider recited his new number. During another call, DeCarlo and a drug associate tossed around the idea of throwing their phones away. The agents braced themselves for the likelihood that the wire would fall silent, but it never did. DeCarlo kept on talking. After dialing someone else, DeCarlo mentioned he wasn't sure whether state or federal officers had busted his 3 customers. Either way, he said, he was getting his shit together in case the police were coming for him too. The man on the line said one of his associates was worried about DeCarlo and wanted to make sure that if he were arrested, he'd hold his tongue. DeCarlo said he would, and that if the authorities caught up with him, he wouldn't call anyone for a week, which would serve as a heads up. DeCarlo then called another of his suppliers, Keith Big Homie Patterson, to ask for a handshake, a term that the surveillance agents knew to mean 5 kilos. 9 days later, the task force had obtained a wiretap on Big Homie's phone. One day in October 2004, nearly a month after the West Side bust, agents listened as Big Homie set up a 4-kilo cocaine deal, and they sent a surveillance team to the location where the deal was about to go down. At the same time, another set of agents tracked DeCarlo to the same location, a building just off Boulevard in the neighborhood known as Old Fourth Ward. Shay, eager to be part of the action, typically was on hand to listen to calls moments after they had been captured. The law forbids anyone but the task force agents from listening to the calls in real time. That day, he was at the HITFA office, and he immediately started readying a stack of search warrants. If the surveillance agents were to catch DeCarlo, they'd need to act fast and hit any address that could be linked to him or to Big Homie. DeCarlo knew something wasn't right. Talking on the phone to someone inside the house, DeCarlo mentioned the white guy with the binoculars stationed outside. Yet he wasn't so spooked that he turned around and left. Instead, DeCarlo walked inside. Shortly thereafter, Big Homie's customer walked out of the front door and toward his car. Moments after he pulled away, the HITFA agents asked the Atlanta Police Department to stop the car, and the officers conducting the stop discovered the 4-kilo package. The agents then moved in on the building where the deal had gone down. Inside, they found 6 more kilos, as well as 15 pounds of marijuana. They also found DeCarlo and Big Homie, both of whom were arrested. That evening and into the next morning, a team of agents hit up DeCarlo's suburban home, where they found $55,000, the apartment on the west side, where they found another $10,000, and DeCarlo's mother's house just south of the city, where they turned up $100,000. DeCarlo was looking at a steep sentence on cocaine trafficking charges. The threat of prison, however, appeared not to be so deflating as another likelihood raised by investigators. Shay told DeCarlo's lawyer that the government might try to build a case against DeCarlo's wife, Sharmella. DeCarlo was devastated by the news. Of course, there was a way for DeCarlo to keep her out of this, and even a way for her to keep their home, which would have been subject to forfeiture had the government been able to show it was purchased with drug proceeds. The thing was, DeCarlo would have to talk, both now and, if necessary, in court. He'd have to give up the names of the people supplying him with his dope. If he did that, the judge would be made aware of DeCarlo's assistance during his sentencing, and he might end up serving a lighter sentence too. DeCarlo folded. 2 days after his arrest, he and his lawyer sat down with Shay and a couple of HITFA agents. DeCarlo told them he got his packages from 2 dealers he'd known since the 3 were kids growing up on Boulevard. Usually the coke was given to him as a front, meaning he didn't have to pay them for it until he sold it. In fact, those 2 dealers were the ones who fronted him with the dope that he in turn sold to the 3 men busted near the Dome. He said they belonged to a drug crew, BMF, that didn't deal out of one particular location per se. Instead, BMF delivered, and only to people they knew and trusted. DeCarlo said he'd be willing to let agents listen as he called and tried to arrange a deal. He knew the suppliers only by their first names, Jeffrey and Omari. Agents immediately told DeCarlo to make the call. Sitting in the HITFA office, DeCarlo dialed Omari, but it was a dead end. Omari's phone had been turned off. DeCarlo then called Jeff to ask him for Omari's new number. Omari likely had ditched the old one after suspecting it was hot. The agents watched as DeCarlo jotted down the digits. He then tried Omari again. This time, Omari answered. DeCarlo asked Omari if he was on deck, meaning holding cocaine. "If you have anything," DeCarlo continued, "I want to get 2 blocks." Omari's reply was succinct. He wasn't talking on the phone anymore. But that wasn't exactly true. In the weeks to come, Omari would continue to talk on the phone, just not to DeCarlo, because he had suspected correctly that DeCarlo had been busted. The weekend after DeCarlo's call, Omari wasn't doing the best job of avoiding trouble. He and his friend Jeffrey Lear were hanging out at the atrium when somebody opened fire on the clubgoers. Police suspected Omari and Jeff were behind the shootings, but after the two men were questioned, police let them go. A week later, the judge granted the agents yet another wiretap, this time for the phones of Jeffrey Lear and Omari McCree. And on that first day up on the wire, just after 4 p.m. on October 22, 2004, agents knew they'd hit it big. They heard Omari talking on Jeff's phone to a security guard from the atrium. The two were discussing, in terms as vague as possible, the shooting that had gone down at the club. On Omari's phone, the chatter was even better. The agents heard several conversations referring to the family's efforts to bond Big Meech out of jail. First, agents heard the warnings about the cars. Watch your flash. Then, there were hints that Omari and Jeff would be called to a meeting later that night. You and Jeff stay available, Yogi told Omari. And with that, 4 agents set out for Omari's townhouse on the outskirts of Buckhead. From a safe distance and from several vantage points, they would watch the comings and goings from Omari's $500,000 residence, and hopefully be ready to lay chase when the call came from Yogi to mobilize BMS ranks. Finally, 7 hours later and shortly after midnight, Meech was out of jail, and BMF was on the move. Omari got the call at 12:45 a.m. In a voice weary but still upbeat, Yogi gave as many details as she could. "He filling out paperwork right now," she said. "He ain't talking on no phones. He said he want to see everybody at the elevator spot." "All right. Well, just call me when you're almost there so I can come on," Omari said. "We ain't but down the street." 5 minutes later, an unidentified man walked out of Omari's front door and drove off in a black Land Rover. One of the agents told another agent, camped out up the street, to note which way the Land Rover headed. That agent watched as the Land Rover turned right outside of Omari's subdivision onto North Druid Hills Road. And he radioed a third agent, who was even farther up the street, with the instructions to follow the vehicle. That agent tailed the Range Rover from North Druid Hills to Roxborough Road, to Viuka Road, and finally onto Peachtree in the heart of Buckhead Village. By then, however, Omari was walking out his front door, and the agent pulled off in order to help the others keep up with their primary target. After disappearing into his garage, Omari sped off in a silver Porsche SUV. One of the surveillance cars took off after him, onto North Druid Hills Road, then onto Roxborough, and from there to Viuka. The other agents didn't even have a chance to join the pursuit. Omari was driving so fast and taking so many sudden turns that nobody could keep up. They lost him. The following evening, Yogi called Omari to chat. It quickly became obvious to the agents that she and Omari were close confidants, and that she was a confidant to Big Meech as well. Yogi spoke at length with Omari. She said that Meech tells her more and more every day. She said that she has the inside scoop on what the boss is thinking and doing. She described Jabo, Meech's hawk-eyed second-in-command, as her boss as well, though not nearly so likable a boss as Meech. Those two, she told Omari, are the biggest tricks out there. She also mentioned that Meech, Baby Blue, and Ill currently were out of town on business. An hour later, Omari got a call from Jeffrey. The news wasn't good. Jeffrey said that the security guard, the one from the atrium, had been fired, presumably because someone found out that the guard had been covering for them. The day after, the agents again staked out Omari at his house. This time, though, they had a bigger team, 11 guys to the 4 who took part in the prior effort. They didn't want Omari to get away again, but they also needed to be sure they followed him into a destination that mattered. They were hoping he'd lead them to the mysterious elevator, which the chatter over the wire revealed to be a headquarters for BMF's crew. Of course, they'd settle for a traffic stop, as long as he was in possession of enough dope to maybe somehow convince him to talk. When Omari called Jeff late that afternoon, moments before he pulled into the driveway, his language suggested he might be arriving with a drug shipment. "When you hear the doorbell thing, come help me get the stuff." "Say what?" Jeff asked. "I'm fixing to pull in. Just come help me get this shit out of the car." An hour after Omari's Porsche pulled into the garage, he took off again. Agents followed him as he made several stops. He picked up Yogi at a house in the posh Atlanta neighborhood of Brookhaven. From there, Omari and Yogi stopped by a CompUSA and a Sprint cell phone store, then drove to a gated subdivision in North Atlanta. Agents awaited just beyond the iron gate, and the Porsche reemerged minutes later. The next stop was a gas station, where agents watched as Amari, Yogi, and a young woman, whom they must have just picked up, dipped inside the store. Finally, after the Porsche made a 10-minute pit stop at Amari's home, the occupants started on a longer trip, and the agents took that to be a sign that there might be something valuable in the car. The surveillance team followed the Porsche along several surface roads before finally hitting the highway. When the Porsche topped out at 85 miles per hour, the agents radioed local deputies to request a traffic stop. Obliging the flashing lights, the Porsche pulled to shoulder onto the ramp between I-285 South and I-20 East, about 20 miles from Amari's home. The young woman who'd been spotted at the gas station was now driving, and Amari was a passenger. Pointing at Amari, the woman told the officer, "Everything in it belonged to him." When officers asked if they could search the car, the woman consented. But the search was in vain. They found zilch. 30 minutes later, Jeff called Amari. "We just got pulled over by the police," Amari told him. "For real?" "Yeah. They searched it?" Amari didn't want to get into all that. I'll call you back, man." The next day, agents listening to the wire perked up at what sounded like not-so-well-guarded drug talk. Yogi had called Amari for help in figuring out how to tally different piles of bills. "Hey, listen," she said. "One rubber band of 20s is what?" A stack." There is a difference, however, between a stack, which holds 2,500, and a double stack, which is worth twice as much. Amari sensed that Yogi wasn't too sure about how to differentiate between them. "It's not a double, is it?" he asked. "One stack," she said, "but it's got 2 rubber bands." "Both tied?" "Yeah, that's 5. "Oh, well, I was about to fuck up. That's why I asked. Thank you very much." In another call, Yogi used an unusual euphemism for what the agents believed to be a dope shipment, and the term she used later would come in handy for the investigators. "Look," Yogi said to Amari, "if Ralphie got something on the back of the truck, would he leave it there all night?" "If he got something on the back of the truck?" "He, put all his dry cleaning on the back of the truck. You don't think he should leave them clothes on the back of the truck like that, should he?" "I don't know. Where are you taking them to?" "He was taking them from the elevator." I don't know. Whatever, man. Just tell him it's whether he want to or he don't." "I mean, it's just a call," she said. "What would you do?" I wouldn't go back, I'll tell you that." "Oh, leave it where it is?" "Yeah." 2 days later, Yogi had some interesting gossip to share. She brought Amari up to speed on matters involving the rapper Young Jeezy. She claimed that Jeezy was behind on some payments for his Lamborghini, which he'd gotten from a dealership in Orlando that regularly secured cars, Lambos, Ferraris, and the like, for BMF. The owner of the shop was Eric Swift Whaley, a 350-pound man with a heart condition that rendered him a far cry from the image his nickname conjured. Yogi was clearly getting a kick out of the situation. "Jeezy called me talking about, 'Let me tell you what that punk-ass Swift did.' I said, 'I know, took your car.'" "He took it?" Amari asked, incredulous. "Yep. He running around here telling everybody his paperwork wasn't straight," Yogi said. The car, she claimed, had been impounded. "Jeezy just ain't made a motherfucking payment on the car in 5 months," Yogi continued. "Swift told me if I get Jeezy to pay a car payment, he'll pay my car payment." "What the hell is wrong with that boy?" "Swift told him the only way he can get it back is if he pay it all the way off. He said that's fucked up. He said, 'Nah, I'm gonna get the Medina.' I said, 'Okay, Hollywood.' I ain't never heard no shit like that. Isn't that crazy? Niggas be frontin' one way and shit. Rappers." As for Yogi and Amari, both were having some self-restraint problems with their new rides. She with her Benz and he with his Porsche. Meech, whom she and Amari often referred to as Dude, had noticed their dilemma. Dude said, "Yogi don't drive the motherfucking car," she told Amari a few minutes after the Jeezy story. "I need to just stop being hard-headed, but when you know you ain't got no transportation, sometimes you just gotta do what you gotta do. I know it's especially hard on you because you hate being in the house." From that, and from what Amari said next, it appeared to the agents that Meech's crew was under a sort of self-imposed house arrest. "Not really. Amari said. I ain't got no problem with it. It's just, I want to get out like one time. I see that's not possible. Yeah, that's for sure. You know these motherfuckers are actually for real laying in wait for a nigga to lead the motherfucking club. Amari was getting a little stir-crazy. Yogi too. And the fact that they fell back on talking on the phone as opposed to going out, that they let their guards down on the cells, and that, likely out of boredom, their lips got looser and looser. Well, that turned out to be better for investigators than had the two of them been hanging out all over town. Their chatter was the foundation of the hit the case. 3 hours later, Yogi and Amari were on the phone again. During this call, Amari's mood had taken a turn for the worse. Yogi, who was constantly trying to lift his spirits, did her best to combat his fatalistic mumblings. She reminded him of his rather fortunate standing with her and with Meech. Half the shit that I tell you, I break confidence in my boss to tell you, she admitted. I know I shouldn't be telling you, but it's because I just see you in a totally different light. I think sometimes I see more than you see yourself. And I have conversations with dude, and I know certain things that he think of you. Amari wasn't having it. As Yogi's tone shifted from admonishing to nurturing and back again, he remained morose. He was worried about the Atrium shootings, and DeCarlo's bust too. He also mentioned that he thought he was being watched. Take heart in one thing, Yogi reiterated. You are in Meech's good graces. Dude just asked me how's everybody, she said. I'm telling him everybody cool, but motherfucking everybody getting an attitude. He's like, shit, everybody just gotta sit in then. I don't want you to sit around your house moping about everything bad that's going on with you. You gotta take all that energy that you spend in moping around and get on with your fucking life, oh. You're still in a good position right now, a real good position. I'm not moping, Amari sulked. I'm not doing shit, man. I'm rolling with everything that's coming my way, but I'm not fixing to be sitting around here all happy-go-lucky smiling at everybody. Like I was saying, everybody ain't against you, oh. I never did say anybody was against me. Ain't nobody with me or against me. I ain't telling you how to run your life, Yogi said, laughing a little, trying to lighten the mood. Shit, well, maybe I just don't feel like talking sometimes. Maybe I'm just sitting here thinking. Maybe that's what I'm doing. You're just my friend, Yogi explained. I care about you, and I don't like seeing you like this, that's all. If it's wrong to be caring about you, then I'll deal with that on my own, but Amari cut her off. I appreciate all the care, he said. I appreciate everything for real, from everybody and whatever, but when it's all said and done, or when it all comes to an end, if they want O, they're coming to get O. I'm still the one that got to deal with it at the end of the day. I do. Maybe I'm preparing myself for the worst. Following day, the worst seemed to be on its way. The security guard from the atrium called again. He reminded Amari that he had been fired. As compensation, he said, he wanted a car. He told Amari, I've done my part. An hour later, the security guard talked to Jeffrey. I need my little bit right now, he said. Tomorrow, Jeffrey replied. The guard had been partly responsible for Amari and Jeffrey becoming suspects, and now he was helping to undo the damage. For that, he'd already been paid $2,500 up front, and he was guaranteed another $2,500 when the case was dismissed. Somewhere along the way, though, the guard decided he wanted more. After hanging up with him, Jeffrey called his 22-year-old girlfriend, Courtney Williams, to vent. The guard had been fired, Jeffrey complained to Courtney, because he said too much about what had happened, though not enough to get Jeffrey and Amari arrested. Now the guard wanted Amari and Jeff to compensate him for his loss of income. Such demands were unwise, Jeffrey hinted to Courtney. People need to realize how much clout we got in this motherfucking city, he told her. The atrium situation was clearly stressing out Amari and Jeffrey. Yogi wanted to ease their worrying, so she stayed on top of the situation, claiming to be in contact with the attorney, Vince DeMock, who was handling the case. So far, neither of them have been charged, and they might not be, thanks to the security guard's willingness to hold back on what he'd witnessed. That's what Yogi wanted to discuss with Amari on November 2nd, 2004. Vince said they really don't have all that they want, she said. So you just really got to take what he said and stay ahead of the game. With that bit of business out of the way, Yogi and Amari wound up talking for nearly an hour, or to be more precise, Yogi talked for the better part of an hour. Amari, as usual, mostly listened. She chatted on about the progress over at the club Meech was opening. It was going to be called Babylon, the same name as the Tony Montana's club in Scarface. She complained about J-Bo, who, compared to Meech, didn't seem to appreciate her. J-Bo didn't hold a candle to Meech, not in her book. Noticing that Amari was zoning out, she switched topics. "What are you doing?" she asked sweetly. "Just thinking," Amari said in a far-off voice. "About what?" "I don't know, everything." "Well, tell me one thing that you're wondering about." Why I keep getting calls from somebody saying I'm fixing to go to jail and shit." "You don't think that's just a talk of the streets?" "Yeah, it might be." "Who's discussing you?" "I don't know, just different people." "You're talking about people from Boulevard, right?" "Nah, no. Somebody called and was like, so-and-so said this." Yogi believed she had an explanation for all that talk. Envy. "I can name 30 niggas on Boulevard that want to see you go to jail right now and hope that they could take your place," she said. "Nigga, don't get on that." Then she got deep. "I see the character traits in you that are in dude," she said. "I see you being a leader. I see a lot of you in him, and I see a lot of him in you. I know what Meech used to be like in his younger days. The conceit that you have, he had, but he's a little more humble now because he's a little bit older. I just see you and him being the same kind of people, and I think people in the family see that also." These were treacherous times, she continued. People felt the heat because the heat was real. Take St. Louis. 13 BMF guys had just been indicted there, including a high-level manager named Duran Wani Gatling, who'd gone on the run. "I'm talking about St. Louis so hot right now, I'm sure everybody think the world is on fire," Yogi said. "We all a little bit warm around this motherfucker, but I just don't see why they keep singling you out. I just think that it would have been done by now, you know what I'm saying? That's just my opinion. I just feel like you sitting there stressing yourself out, and it's not time for you to stress yourself out, you know? Everybody got their time. I don't think it's yours, though." The most Amari could offer in response was a long, to which Yogi responded, "Let it go, baby." Of course, Amari couldn't. November 4th, 2004 was a day of bad omens. Some of them obvious, others not. 2 days had passed since Yogi's extended pep talk, and Amari was as paranoid as ever. His first order of business that afternoon was to help bond one of his associates out of jail. DeCarlo Hoskins had been locked up for nearly 3 weeks, and had just that day been granted a $100,000 bond. Amari felt obligated to help. You had to look after those who could incriminate you, after all. Little did Amari know that it was too late. A couple of hours later, Amari got an ominous phone call. The man on the line identified himself as Amari's brother. Investigators knew that wasn't the case, though they didn't know who the caller was. "I need to talk to you real urgent," the man said. Real important, my nigga." "It's bad?" Amari asked. "Hell yeah, I think it is." "About me?" "Yeah, nigga, you heard me?" "Man, your shit is all right? Your jack?" Amari wasn't all that sure anymore. Despite the fact that he and Yogi had been talking freely on his cell, he began to doubt it was safe. I'm gonna call you from another," Amari said. "Hurry up, son." Amari's paranoia was mounting. One of his next calls showed just how freaked out he'd become, and how close he was to figuring out what exactly was going on. Amari called to request a favor from a woman, who in turn called a friend of hers on another line. Her friend worked at the Atlanta Police Department. Amari was worried that black truck he kept noticing, a truck parked on the curb just up the street from his house, might be part of a surveillance team. Earlier, he jotted down the truck's tag number. Now he was reading it to the woman, who repeated it to her police source. The agents listening in could tell that the person who betrayed them was inside the APD, because they were able to trace the number back to the department. The actual perpetrator, however, was never identified. The woman told Amari that she'd get back to him soon with some info. A half hour later, Jeffrey called Amari with an idea that he thought might help ease some of their pressure. Jeffrey's girlfriend Courtney was out of town, so Jeffrey offered to bring the clothes to her apartment on Highland Avenue. She just so happened to live in the same complex where, exactly 2 months before, Misty Carter and Ulysses Hackett were shot to death in Misty's bed. Yeah, Omari said, that's cool. The surveillance agents weren't able to maintain a tail on Jeffrey as he drove the clothes over to Courtney's. Thus, the agents were left thinking that they'd missed out on a golden opportunity, a convergence of events that surely wouldn't happen again, until they realized, listening to The Wire the next day, that all was not lost. Just before 5:30 p.m. on November 5th, 2004, a taxi pulled up to Omari's house, and the surveillance agents watched as Courtney stepped out. She'd just come from the airport, according to The Wire, and was about to leave town again. 10 minutes later, agents saw her pull out of the garage in a white Cadillac SUV, followed moments later by Jeffrey, driving the Porsche. The agents, who were joined by the DEA this time around, split into two teams. 3 guys took after Courtney, and the other 3 after Jeff. The Porsche was driving wildly. Jeffrey gunned it through a red light at Spring Street and North Avenue, entering the thick of downtown Atlanta. The agents lost him. It was around that moment, while Jeffrey and Courtney were both driving, that Jeffrey decided to call Courtney to let her know the clothes were at her apartment. Courtney says she wanted the clothes out of there, and she wanted to be rid of Jeffrey too, so the clothes had to be moved, and quick. Back at HIT headquarters, the agents were scrambling to let the surveillance team know what was going on. The team had to get to Courtney, and quick. I'm sick of this dirty business, they heard Courtney say. So I'm just trying to figure out if you're going to be there within the next 30 minutes, because I'm about to go out of town. You fixing to go out of town? Where you going? Out of town, she said dryly. Damn. Well, can I keep your key while you out of town? Jeffrey pleaded. Can you keep my key while I'm out of town? You missed the point. I just changed my number. Courtney, I need to keep those clothes over there for real, because you don't even understand right now. You're right, she said. I don't understand. Can I just keep the clothes over there, please? Can I just keep the keys until you get back? I'm sorry. You can't keep my key. Courtney, can I please keep the key? Please. I already said no. All right. Well, if you're going to be selfish like that, I'm not being selfish. All right. Well, I'm on my way. Courtney, fortunately, was easier for the surveillance team to keep up with. The agents followed her all the way to her Highland Avenue apartment complex. A few minutes later, Jeffrey pulled up in the Porsche. Both of them went inside her apartment. Shortly thereafter, the couple emerged with a duffel bag. They climbed into the Porsche and headed toward the highway. The agents pursuing them called in Atlanta police. It was time for another traffic stop. The cops caught up with the Porsche on I-75 at Pine Street, near the heart of downtown. Jeffrey pulled to the shoulder of the exit ramp. Investigators, who were met on the scene by Fulton prosecutor Shea, approached the SUV, guns drawn. They ordered Jeffrey and Courtney out of the vehicle, then cuffed them and put them in separate cars. In the back seat of the Porsche, in plain view, the agents found an open duffel bag stuffed with 10 kilos. Shea and the agents drove the couple to Courtney's apartment, where she consented to a search. While some agents were digging through her stuff, others tried to pressure her to talk. It said she should have been well aware that Jeffrey and Omari were up to no good. These guys don't work and they live in a $500,000 home and they drive an $80,000 truck, one of them told her. Where do you think they got their money from? But Courtney wouldn't budge. She just sat there staring at them. In the course of the search, the agents didn't turn up anything, though the 10 kilos in the back of the Porsche were more than enough to arrest the couple and put them away for a while. Instead, Shea decided to let them go. It was a ballsy move, but he figured Jeff and Courtney would keep talking on the phone, and that might yield even better information over the wire. When Omari called Jeffrey a few hours later, Omari knew something was up. Yet he pressed Jeffrey to talk, despite Jeffrey's insistence that it was a bad idea. Don't want to talk right now, Jeffrey said as soon as he answered. Bye. What? Omari asked. Bye. The line went dead. 30 seconds later, Omari called again. Jeffrey greeted him with a terse, don't want to talk. Hey, what the fuck you talking about? Don't want to talk, man. Listen to me, please. Just listen to me, for real. You in trouble? Don't want to talk. Come on, for real, please. Come on. Jeffrey hung up. A minute later, he called Omari with instructions. Yogi Bear's house, Jeff said. Huh? Omari asked. Yogi Bear's house. Who? Yogi Bear's house. Yogi what? Yogi Bear's house. Go to Yogi Bear's house. Go? Go to Yogi Bear's house, all right? Are you all right, though? That's what I'm asking you. Can you just go there? I'm all right now, but can you... All right. Amari tried Jeffrey's girlfriend next. She could barely form the words around the tears. Hello? Courtney mumbled. What you crying for? Amari asked. He didn't let you know? What? Everything just went wrong, Courtney sobbed. Just leave the house, all right? Are you at your house? No. Okay. Well, as long as you left there, you should be straight. Would you stop? Look, just tell me what happened. I don't want to talk on the phone. You know what I'm saying? The fucking feds, whoever they was, just dropped out on us. 3 days later, Yogi called Meech to discuss business. By then, there was a wire up on her, too. Of course, Meech wasn't into talking on phones. He said they could talk about whatever they needed to discuss once she arrived in L.A. That day, Yogi boarded a commercial jet bound for California. So did 2 task force agents. They followed her to California, hoping to shadow her all the way to her meeting with Meech. But Yogi proved difficult to keep up with. While driving through L.A., she made abrupt turns, turning back on her tracks and traveling in broad circles. Eventually, she shook them. 2 days later, Yogi was back in Atlanta. Over the phone, Meech told her he'd be back the day after next. Even then, Jeff and Amari were still talking on their cell phones, but their conversations were waning. They needed to come up with a plan and some cash. The package they'd lost was a front, meaning they owed a bunch of money to the boss, but they had no product to sell. They weren't exactly making themselves scarce, though. Both men were at their house when Shays stopped by on November 19, 2004, to talk to Jeffrey about the bust. Amari, who wasn't sure whether he, too, had been tied to the cocaine in the backseat of the Porsche, jumped off the balcony in back of the house, gun in hand, and ran. The surveillance team stationed outside watched his retreat. Jeffrey's girlfriend was smarter. Within days of the bust, Courtney ditched her Highland Avenue digs. She moved, she would later say, out of fear. That evening, Meech called Yogi for an update. What happened? He asked. Yogi mentioned that the police had shown up at Jeff and Omari's, and that Omari had skirted them. I thought he moved, Meech said. Yogi said he hadn't. He's being very stupid, Meech told her, and that's why I'm not fucking with that man right now. Out of an abundance of caution, Meech had switched things up. He no longer felt safe distributing cocaine out of the same location Jeffrey and Amari had visited. The house in a residential, wooded part of Buckhead would have to be shuttered. It was time to close the gate. Meech didn't move the operation too far, about a mile away, in a similar upscale neighborhood. Meech set up shop at an even more impressive abode. The ultra-modern house was so grandiose that some BMF associates referred to it as the Bugsy Siegel, because it was the type of place that only the flashiest gangster would inhabit. Meech had another name for it. He called it Space Mountain. During the first few weeks that BMF operated out of Space Mountain, the limos from California came and went, delivering 100 kilos at a time and driving off with millions in cash. The house held as much as $6 million at a time, which BMF associates, including a convicted murderer named Ralphie Sims, counted by hand. Meech tried to make his presence scarce around Space Mountain. As always, he had J-Bo oversee the drug shipments. The customers would call first to let J-Bo know how many kilos to set aside. J-Bo would tell the lower-tier workers, including Ralphie, to be ready and waiting for the customers to arrive. The transaction would take mere minutes. Even so, years later, Ralphie would remember 2 of the customers vividly. One was Doc Marshall, who did BMF's books. The other customer to whom Ralphie allegedly handed kilos of dope was hard to forget. After all, he was a soon-to-be famous rapper, Young Jeezy. Ralphie also was on hand the day a frantic order came down from Meech. It was 2 days before Thanksgiving, 2004. Everybody was getting ready to go to Miami for the holiday. That afternoon, Ralphie left Space Mountain, but just for a minute. He was only going to stop at the store for cigars. But shortly after he pulled out of the driveway, he was stopped by police. It appeared they'd been watching the house. Ralphie handed over a license with a fake name. Had he not adopted the alias, he'd have found himself in serious trouble. He currently was in violation of his probation, which he'd received the prior year after serving time on a Missouri murder charge. The cops ran the license and it came back clean. Like most of the rest of Meech's crew, Ralphie had gotten a legitimate license through a crooked source inside the Tennessee DMV. The cops let him go. At around the same time, Meech was driving over to 404 Motorsports to check on one of his cars, which was being worked on at the dealership shop. He noticed that someone, apparently an undercover agent, appeared to be following him. Once he heard about Ralphie getting pulled over, he knew that Space Mountain had been compromised. He called J-Bo and told him what to do. Clean up the house. There were 100 kilos inside, and they had to be moved fast. That same afternoon, a contractor was at Space Mountain, doing repairs to the roof. He knew most of the crew that hung out at the house by sight, because he'd done numerous repairs at both that house and the gate. In fact, he'd installed the gate at the gate. The contractor believed that the men who he met, both J-Bo and Ralphie, as well as a short, charming, likable guy called Ill, were in the music business. That's what they told him anyway. Their claim was supported by the fact that there were often limos, Lambos, Ferraris, and Hummers parked in Space Mountain's driveway. As the contractor was finishing up the job on the roof, he noticed people running from the house, scrambling for their cars. He recognized one of them as J-Bo. Soon thereafter, he packed up and left, only to return a few hours later. He was supposed to fix a leak inside the house. By then, it was dark, and he was startled to find that the house was crawling with local police and federal agents. They were executing a search warrant, but they were a few hours too late. In his affidavit for the search warrant, HITTA Task Force agent Walt Britt had cited the search a year earlier of the Flannery brothers' White House. He described the Porsche driven by Jeffrey Lear that had been pulled over 2 weeks earlier, loaded with 10 kilos. He laid out Meech's connection to Yogi, his assistant, and her relationship with both Jeffrey and Omari. He also wrote that a confidential source had claimed Meech was supposed to be paying off debts that very day, including money he owed to attorney Vince DeMock for his representation of Jeffrey, Omari, and a handful of other BMF members. That meeting was supposed to take place at a room inside the Ritz-Carlton Buckhead. Britt even went so far as to claim that a recent article in hip-hop magazine, The Source, hinted at Meech's role as a drug boss. In the article, Meech was quoted as saying, "We all are hard-working hustlers, but none of us rob, steal, or kill for our money. We always just hustling in whatever way we can, whether it's selling CDs or whatever we have to do out here." In his affidavit for the search warrant, Britt wrote, "Missing amongst the crime's denials is selling drugs." That evening, November 23, 2004, the judge signed off on the warrant, and Britt, Shay, Harvey, Burns, and several other law enforcement agents showed up at Space Mountain. Nobody was inside the boxy structure, which sat off the road behind an iron gate and featured a wall of windows facing the woods. But the elegant interior, which featured a spiral staircase ascending to an open-air loft, did turn up some items of interest. Inside, the agents found guns, several BMF jerseys, and the Tennessee driver's license with J-Bo's picture and the fake name, Derek Williams. In the garage, they found cloth wrappings that tested positive for cocaine residue, but they didn't find any drugs. When the contractor showed up, DEA agent Harvey broke away from the others to talk to him. The contractor said that he had a phone number for one of the men who hung around the house. His name was Ill. Harvey told the contractor he'd follow up with him. Upon leaving, the contractor went directly to Ill's house in the suburbs. He knew where Ill lived because he'd done renovations for him, too. He knocked on the front door. No answer. So he went around back to the deck to peek through the glass doors. He knocked on the glass. A very nervous Fleming Ill Daniels opened. He was hanging out with Ralphie. Both men were dressed down in their boxer shorts. In the background, Scarface was on TV. They seemed to be spooked by something. The contractor told Ill what he'd seen at Space Mountain, but Ill, as well as the rest of the crew, already knew. The next day, Meech decided he was done with Atlanta for a while. He was already planning on heading down to Miami to get away from things for a bit, and he figured he might as well extend the vacation. In Miami, he'd find a warmer reception and a more grandiose home. The week before Christmas 2004, he leased, through an associate of course, a deco-styled mansion in South Beach. The rent was $30,000 a month. By that time, it seemed Omari McCree had finally disappeared.